Tonight, I want to tell you about a choice that was never made, and a boy who was never found by the people who should have found him first. It is the story of Anakin Skywalker, the chosen one of Jedi prophecy, but not the Anakin Skywalker the Jedi were waiting for. This is what happened instead, how the Sith discovered him before the Jedi did, and how that accident of timing changed everything. Over the coming hours, we will walk the whole of it together. His birth in secrecy, his training in darkness, the slow realization of the Jedi that something catastrophic had already occurred, and the person he became in a future they could not prevent. But first, we have to go back to the beginning, to a moment when a woman on a forgotten planet gave birth to a son she could not explain, and a shadow in the Force took notice. It is 32 years before the events of A New Hope, on the desert world of Tatooine, a planet so remote and so insignificant that the Galactic Republic barely acknowledges it exists. The planet orbits in the Outer Rim territories, far enough from Coruscant and the centers of power that the laws of the Republic are little more than rumors here. Instead, Tatooine belongs to the Hutts, vast, ancient criminal syndicates who have made their fortunes in slavery, spice trade, and the careful business of controlling everything that moves through these sands. In the city of Mos Espa, in a shop that deals in salvage and broken machinery, a woman named Shmi Skywalker gave birth in the dark. She was a slave, owned and possessed like the rusted droids and engine parts that surrounded her, and when she told the others what had happened, when she said there had been no father, that she had simply found herself pregnant and then delivered the child herself, the story was met with the kind of silence that follows an impossibility. There was no explanation that fit the world as anyone understood it. She had a son, and no one could say how. The child came into the galaxy with eyes that were already learning to focus, lungs that drew the hot desert air, and something else. Something that no scanner could fully measure and no midwife could quite put a name to. His mother looked at him and saw a gift she did not know how to protect. In the weeks after his birth, the boy existed in the way that very young infants do, sleeping, feeding, crying, gradually coming into awareness of the world around him. His mother held him when she could, in the brief moments her slavery allowed, and spoke softly to him in the dark. She did not yet know how to tell him that he belonged to someone else, that his body and his future had been claimed before his eyes had even opened. But there was no need to tell him yet. For a few weeks, he was only a child. Across the galaxy, in the shadow spaces where the Sith operated, something shifted. The Sith had long ago learned to perceive the Force in ways that the Jedi could not, or rather, in ways the Jedi chose not to, constrained as they were by their philosophy of balance and restraint. The dark side granted a kind of sensitivity to disturbance, to rupture, to the sudden arrival of power where no power had existed before. And on this day, a ripple moved through the Force that was unlike anything recorded in living memory. It was a birth, but not an ordinary birth. It was the arrival of a consciousness so saturated with Force potential, so utterly overflowing with the raw material of power itself, that it registered not as a person, but as a phenomenon. The Sith Master sensed it, a man who went by the name Darth Sidious, though that was one of many names, and not the one his mother had called him. He was a patient man, a man who thought in decades and centuries, who had orchestrated events across the galaxy so subtly that the Republic did not yet know it was being controlled. He sat in meditation, and in the depths of the dark side, he perceived a vision, a thread in the Force that led outward to the Rim, to a planet so unremarkable that it barely registered on the star charts of the civilized worlds. Tatooine. A child. A rawness of power that exceeded anything the Sith records contained. Sidious emerged from meditation slowly, the way a man surfaces from deep water. His apprentice, a Zabrak night brother named Darth Maul, was waiting in the darkness beyond the chamber, waiting as apprentices do. with that particular combination of loyalty and hunger that the rule of two cultivated. The rule of two was the engine of all Sith strategy. Only a master and an apprentice, forever, across the generations, each one destined to eventually betray and supplant the other, an eternal cycle of strength proving itself through succession. But the rule of two required something, and that something was patience. You could not conquer the Jedi and the Republic with two people in a year, or a decade, or even a lifetime. You had to erode them from inside, place pieces on the board, allow events to unfold according to designs so subtle that no one could see the hand directing them. This required the right pieces. This required the right tools. And what Sidious had just felt in the Force was something that might be the greatest tool that had ever existed. He began, in that moment, to plan. On Tatooine, in the darkness of a slave quarter, SHMI Skywalker did not know that she had been perceived. She did not know that somewhere in the galaxy, a shadow was already in motion toward her child. She only knew what she held in her arms, a son, a gift, and a burden she was not yet certain she could bear. She whispered to him in the dark, the way mothers do, promising him things she had no power to give, safety, freedom, a life that was his own to live. In the distance, the twin suns of Tatooine were setting, and the desert was cooling into night, and across the vastness of space, the machinery of dark design was already beginning to turn. Everything that followed, all the suffering that would come, all the choice and loss, all the terrible path that would lead from this moment forward, was already being set in motion by a single vision in the dark. But none of that was visible yet. For now, there was only a child, breathing in the heat of the desert and a mother's hands, and the first moment of a life that the universe was already beginning to claim. There's something unsettling about a beginning when you know what comes after. But that's the shape of the story we need to tell, and so we begin it here, in the dark, with a child who did not yet know that he had been seen. In the weeks that followed the boy's birth, somewhere in the depths of the Sith domain, a presence that had not moved for months opened its eyes with terrible intention. His name was Higo Damask, though the galaxy knew him by another face entirely. Magister Damask, financier, philanthropist, a moon gentleman of impeccable breeding and almost unimaginable wealth. But the face was a mask, and had been for decades, and what lay beneath it was something far older and far darker than any human institution. He was Darth Plagueis, master of the Sith, heir to the rule of two that Darth Bane had carved into the Order's very bones 1,000 years before. Plagueis had spent centuries, literally centuries, studying the mysteries of the midi-chlorians, those microscopic servants of the Force that dwelt in every living cell and bound all life to the dark side's will. He had learned to speak to them, to negotiate with them, to bend them toward purposes that should not have been possible. The extension of life beyond its natural span, the prevention of death itself, the creation of life where no life should exist. And now, through the vast network of his financial empire and the careful manipulations of his apprentice, he had sensed something that should not exist. A child born of nothing, conceived by no one, the midi-chlorians themselves made flesh, carrying within his body a presence in the Force so luminous and so raw that it had echoed across the void like a bell struck in absolute silence. Plagueis understood immediately what he was looking at. Not a fluke, not an accident. A response. For years, he had been pushing against the boundaries of life itself, testing the limits of the midi-chlorians, asking them impossible questions through the language of the dark side. And the Force, which is not kind, which is not neutral, which is a living thing in its own way, had answered him. It had created a counter. A boy. An instrument of such staggering potential that Plagueis could feel its weight across the galaxy, the way you can feel the presence of a great storm before it reaches you. The irony, of course, was exquisite. The Jedi spoke in whispers of a chosen one, some child spoken of in their precious prophecies, who would one day bring balance to the Force. They were half-blind with hope and tradition, unable to see what was unfolding right in front of them. Plagueis saw it clearly. Here, in a junk dealer's compound on a desert world no one cared about, was a boy whose midi-chlorian count exceeded anything in recorded history. Higher even than Yoda, that ancient relic who had squandered centuries of study in service to the light. And that boy was unclaimed, unguarded, surrounded only by his mother and the dust of a planet so far removed from the Jedi Temple that they would never know to look there until it was far too late. The plan, therefore, was simple, though executing it would require patience and the careful coordination of instruments already in motion. Plagueis' apprentice, Darth Sidious, the senator from Naboo, young Sheev Palpatine, who wore his own mask so skillfully that even other senators could not see the true shape of him, had already begun his work on the Republic's weakness. The Trade Federation was moving against Naboo. The blockade would create precisely the kind of chaos that Palpatine would need to climb toward power. But there was no reason these threads should remain separate. Plagueis began to orchestrate, with the methodical patience of someone who measured time not in years, but in decades. Through Damask Holdings, his vast financial interest in the intergalactic banking clan, the Moon-run institution that held so much of the galaxy's wealth in its careful hands, he quietly began to cultivate relationships with the slavers and traders who moved through the Outer Rim. Tatooine's population was controlled by the Hutt cartel, yes, but the Hutts themselves were not beyond influence, and the Toydarians who served them, merchants like Watto, could be moved by the promise of credits and by the subtle application of Force persuasion through intermediaries. There was no rush. The rule of two taught patience above all things. The master does not simply reach out and take what he wants. He orchestrates, he plants seeds, he watches the garden grow until the fruit is ripe for plucking. And while Plagueis plotted the boy's retrieval, he also allowed himself, in the quiet chambers where he conducted his deepest work, a moment of genuine excitement that was rare for someone of his age and experience. Here, at last, was the answer he had been seeking. All those years of forcing midi-chlorians to bend to his will, all those experiments and near-deaths and brilliant failures had been leading toward this. A boy born of the Force itself, saturated with it, carrying within him potential that no training could have created. If Plagueis could turn this child, could shape him in the ways of the Sith before the Jedi even realized he existed, then immortality was not merely possible, it was assured. A dark side prodigy of that magnitude, wielding Sith knowledge and power refined across generations, would be immune to the weaknesses of age, to the encroachments of death itself. Or perhaps, and here Plagueis allowed himself to imagine, the boy himself might hold the secret, might carry within those midi-chlorians some understanding of how life could be preserved, how death could be negotiated with, and ultimately, irreversibly, defeated. It was a beautiful thought, the kind of thought that had sustained him through centuries of dark study. So the master of the Sith, in the guise of Magister Damask, continued about his business in the gleaming towers of Moonalinst and Coruscant, attended to his financial empire, smiled his controlled smile at senators and bankers and corporate heads who had no idea they were already instruments in a symphony they could not hear. And somewhere on Tatooine, a boy whose mother called him Anakin played in the dust and had no idea that the attention of the most powerful dark side user in the galaxy had already begun to turn toward him like the slow rotation of a vast machine. He had, perhaps, a few years left of childhood. Plagueis would allow him that much grace. After all, children were more easily broken when they had known a little happiness first. There is something almost kind in that calculation, if you look at it a certain way, though kindness was not what Plagueis intended and never had been. 2 years after the birth that the Force itself seemed to whisper into existence, a small boy played in the dust outside a junk shop in Mos Spa, and the weight of distant calculations was already settling around him like a heat haze. His mother, SHMI, kept him close when she could, though her own days belonged to Watto, the Toydarian junk dealer who held papers that declared him her owner, and therefore everything she made or built or birthed belonged to him as well. Watto was not a cruel man by the standards of Tatooine, which is to say he was precisely as cruel as the dust and economics demanded, and no more and no less. He ran his shop on reputation and transaction, on knowing who owed whom and what debts looked like when they had to be paid. What Watto did not know was that he himself was being watched, not by the Republic, which had long ago decided Tatooine was too distant and too difficult to govern, but by something older and far more patient. Somewhere in the financial networks of the galaxy, in the pristine offices of Damask Holdings, registered on Moonalist, a moon named Higo Damask was reviewing information that had been gathered about a desert planet and a slave woman and her impossible son. Damask, to anyone who met him, was a banker, a man of numbers and long-term investment, a figure of such quiet influence that senators and industrialists sought his counsel on matters of credit and commerce. What those senators did not know was that Damask was also Darth Plagueis, a Sith Lord whose understanding of the Force had advanced far beyond what any Jedi scholar could have imagined, and whose ambitions operated on a scale measured in decades and centuries. Plagueis had spent lifetimes studying the relationship between the Force and life itself, learning to manipulate the midi-chlorians that lived in every cell, the microscopic servants of the Force that gave some beings power and left others ordinary. He had wondered, in the deep places of his meditation, if the Force itself could be made to create life, to write a being into existence as an answer to a problem. And now, something in the Force had answered. A child of impossible midi-chlorian, count on a world, no one important paid attention to. The coincidence was so precise that Plagueis, who believed in the discipline of causality, did not believe it was coincidence at all. But retrieving the child would require patience and a kind of delicate artistry. The boy could not simply be taken, because the moment he vanished, word would eventually reach the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, and the Jedi, however slow and bureaucratic they often were, would begin to search. Better to let the boy remain where he was, a slave on Tatooine, unremarkable to the larger galaxy, until the moment was right. But first, the machinery had to be set in motion. Among the various tools Plagueis had at his disposal were several agents trained in the dark side, individuals whose loyalty was ensured through a mixture of terror and genuine dark side power, and whose ability to move through criminal networks was one of their greatest assets. One such agent arrived on Tatooine under the cover of a spice merchant, moving through the markets and cantinas of Mos Spa and Mos Eisley with the ease of someone who understood that information flowed like water in the spaces between official commerce. This agent did not contact Watto directly. Instead, the agent made it known to certain middlemen in the slave trade, brokers and dealers who trafficked in flesh across the Outer Rim, that there was significant credit to be had for anyone who could keep careful watch on a particular slave child in a junk shop, and who could ensure, at the appropriate moment, that the child would be available for transport off-world. The beauty of this approach was that no one had to understand the larger picture. Watto received word through his normal channels of a wealthy collector interested in purchasing a healthy young slave from Tatooine. Nothing unusual. The collector was represented as being based out of the Outer Rim, and the credit offered was substantial enough to be interesting even to a businessman as shrewd as a Toydarian. The offer included a contingency. The slave would need to be implanted with a control chip if it was not already, to ensure compliance during transport and to prevent any unfortunate escape attempts. Anakin, like all slaves on Tatooine, was already implanted with such a device, a surgical transmitter that sat at the base of his skull, a small piece of technology that connected him to a detonator, a a constant, invisible leash that ensured obedience. Watto did not see the larger machinery. He saw only that a transaction was being offered, that the terms were favorable, and that a Toydarian businessman who had built his career on good credit management would be foolish to refuse easy payment. What Watto did not know was that the agent had also been working through other channels. The Hutt cartel, which controlled much of Tatooine's underworld, was being carefully influenced through its own dark side liaison, a shadow being with connections to the highest reaches of power. The Hutts, for generations, had viewed slaves as property and merchandise, nothing more, and they responded to credit and leverage with the reliability of gravity. If a profitable arrangement could be made, if a slave child could be routed through the normal mechanisms of the slave trade and delivered to a buyer with sufficient resources to handle the transaction, then there was no reason for any Hutt to object. And so the machinery turned, the gears of commerce and exploitation fitting together in ways that none of the individual participants fully understood, each one seeing only their own small angle of advantage, their own local profit. Back at the junk shop, Anakin played in the dust, unaware that his future was being written in ledgers and communication frequencies, in debts called in and favors arranged. His mother watched him with a love that was absolute and entirely helpless, because she understood the true nature of slavery, that the people you loved most were the first things they could take from you. She could not have known that the empire that would one day fall had already begun, in the most patient and invisible of ways, to rise. She could only hold her son when she could and hope, as slaves have always hoped, for a mercy that the universe was not organized to provide. 2 years into his life, Anakin Skywalker remained in the light of Tatooine's twin sons, the light of his mother's love, and the light of a force he was not yet trained to sense or understand. But in the shadows of distant office buildings, and in the quiet conversations of agents moving through spaceports, the machinery that would take that light from him was already running, already pulling him toward the darkness like a current in deep water. And the Jedi, for all their connection to the Force, had no idea any of it was happening. It is easy, I think, to look at the Jedi Order in this moment and judge them for their blindness, for the way they failed to sense this terrible machinery turning in the dark. But the truth is more complicated and perhaps more sad. They were looking in their way, but they were looking in the wrong direction, toward the future they expected to see rather than the future that was actually arriving. 2 years have passed since the machinery of the Sith began to turn, and on Tatooine, in the shadow of Mos Espa's bustling slave quarter, a boy of no more than 4 years old continues to live an ordinary life that is no longer ordinary at all. Anakin does not know this yet, of course. He knows only what all children know, the rhythm of work, the heat of the twin suns, the sound of his mother's voice when she calls him inside before the desert cools to dark. SHMI still works in Watto's household, still mends things and carries water, and in the evening she sits with her son and teaches him the small resistances, how to fix what is broken, how to find kindness in a world that offers none freely, how to believe that somewhere, somehow, there is more waiting for him than the dust of this planet. What SHMI cannot know is that every transaction that brings a piece of salvage to Watto's shop, every credit that passes through the Toydarian's clawed hands, is part of a web laid by men and institutions she has never heard of and will never meet. The intergalactic banking clan extends across thousands of worlds, and at its heart, moving with the patience of a thing that knows it has centuries, is a being who has spent lifetimes perfecting the art of waiting. Darth Plagueis, hidden behind the respectable face of Magister Damask, has orchestrated the cascade of events that placed Anakin within reach. The arrangement with certain Hutt intermediaries, the subtle incentives whispered to Watto about debts and profit, the careful positioning of agents who move through the Outer Rim as merchants and traders and slavers. And now, in the autumn of 30 BBY, the machinery turns a final time, and the time has come to collect what has been promised. The extraction team arrives on Tatooine on a transport vessel bearing the insignia of a legitimate spice merchant, and they move with the quiet efficiency of those who have done such work before, who understand that haste leaves traces and traces lead to questions. They come in the late afternoon, when the heat shimmers off the sand and the inhabitants of Mos Espa have retreated into the relative cool of their dwellings and shops, and they move toward the quarters where SHMI keeps her small room and her son. Watto, when they arrive at his establishment to make the final arrangement, accepts the payment with the casual indifference of a being for whom the sale of a single slave is merely the movement of merchandise, a ledger entry, a small profit realized. He does not think about what will happen to the boy. That is not Watto's concern, and it has never been his way to inquire too closely into the business of those who have sufficient credits to purchase his wares. What Watto does not understand, what he has been deliberately kept from understanding, is that the boy he is selling is not being purchased as a laborer or a curiosity or a useful asset, but as a potential vessel for a power that reaches across the galaxy and down into the deepest, most violent places of the human heart. When the extraction team arrives at the small room where SHMI and her son live, they do not hesitate and they do not negotiate. SHMI's resistance is immediate and absolute. She understands in that moment, with a clarity that is almost prescient, that something fundamental is being taken from her that cannot be replaced, that the small world she has built around this child is collapsing into pieces. The explosive device embedded in her body, a tool of control that all slaves on Tatooine carry, is no longer merely a threat. It becomes a statement of ownership, a final enforcement of powerlessness. She can do nothing. Anakin, who is 4 years old and has never known a life beyond the care of his mother and the heat of the desert, is lifted away from her, crying in the incomprehension that only a small child can manage when the foundational fact of his world is suddenly removed. I imagine that he called for her. I imagine that he reached back with his small hands and his small voice, not yet understanding that this is not the kind of separation from which you return, not the kind of thing that can be mended with an apology or an explanation or the simple reassurance that comes from a mother's presence. SHMI's powerlessness is absolute. She can only stand, bound by the certainty of her own destruction should she resist, and watch as the only person she has ever loved completely is carried out into the desert evening and loaded into a vessel that will carry him away from Tatooine forever. There is no force in the galaxy that will help her. The Jedi, had they known of her plight, were too far away to intervene, and they have no knowledge that this boy, this particular boy, has been taken at all. The vessel rises from Tatooine and breaks atmosphere, and the twin suns, Tatooine and Tatoo-II, the dual stars that have burned over the desert for all of Anakin's life, recede beneath him until they are visible only as a fading point of light, and then as a memory. From the perspective of the wider galaxy, nothing significant has occurred. A transport vessel departs the outer rim carrying cargo, and no alarm is raised, and no inquiry is made. But something has been severed, quietly and completely, and it cannot be repaired. The boy's attachment to his mother, which is to say, his last genuine anchor to the light side of the Force, the only person on Tatooine who had given him any reason to believe that love might be stronger than suffering, has been violently and irrevocably severed. In the methodology of the dark side, in the teachings of the Sith that have been refined across centuries of cruelty, the removal of attachments is the necessary first step. The dark side feeds on isolation, on the rupture of bonds, on the terror and rage that grows in the space where love used to be. What SHMI had given her son over 4 years, the instruction that his heart was a strength, the example of her own quiet courage, the foundation of the belief that somewhere, someone had chosen him and would always choose him, is now weaponized against him. The Sith understand that a severed child, alone in darkness, will eventually turn to rage, and rage can be refined, directed, and weaponized into something terrible. And so Anakin Skywalker leaves Tatooine. carried away from the only life he has ever known, from the only person who has ever loved him without condition or reservation, into a darkness that is vast and patient and has already prepared a place for him. The desert cools to night behind him, and the boy from Tatooine, the chosen one whose midi-chlorian count has never been matched, the child born of the Force itself, becomes instead a prisoner, and the long work of the Sith, the patient, terrible work of turning a light into an instrument of darkness, begins in earnest. He traveled in darkness, the child, in the hold of a vessel whose name he would never know, cradled in the arms of a woman whose face he would not remember because she did not speak to him and did not meet his eyes. Anakin was 4 years old, and the last coherent memory he carried of light was his mother's hand releasing his own, then the explosive force of her body falling backward as the slave chip detonated in her chest. The journey lasted weeks, or perhaps longer. Time moves differently for a child in the dark, and he had already begun to understand, in the way very young children do, that screaming brought no one. When the vessel finally emerged from hyperspace, it approached a world that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Korriban, the ancient seat of the Sith, where the very bedrock sang with the echoes of 1,000 years of rage. The academy itself was carved into the red rock of a cliff face, its architecture a marriage of function and menace. Towers that rose like fangs, corridors that descended into depths from which no echo returned. There were other children there, perhaps a dozen, each one taken from somewhere in the outer rim, each one bearing the particular hollow look of someone who had learned already that the world does not care. Anakin was placed in a cell that was not quite a cell, a chamber with stone walls and a single narrow window cut so high that he could not reach it, not yet, though he would spend hours trying. A protocol droid, silver and precise, and utterly without kindness, delivered meals and water once daily, and spoke to him in a voice that carried the weight of all the discipline he would come to know. "Your name is no longer necessary," the droid explained with the careful enunciation of something reading from a script. "You will be called Aspirant 7. You will speak when spoken to. You will obey without question. You will survive, or you will not." The first weeks were a kind of silence, a long grey space in which Anakin understood that resistance was not being punished because resistance was not being noticed. On Tatooine, his mother had taught him how to find water in broken machinery, how to coax life from things that were supposed to be dead, and he had loved her for it, had felt in his small bones that this was the world telling him who he was. Here, no one spoke of love, and no one spoke of fixing things. Instead, there were lessons. They came at irregular intervals, designed, he would later understand, precisely so that the body could never settle into the comfort of routine. A tall figure in black robes, whose face remained obscured by shadow and purpose, would appear in the training chamber and ask each child a single question. "What do you want more than anything in the world?" The question was not idle, and the answer mattered, because the answer determined what the Sith trainers would take from you. Anakin, when his turn came, was silent for so long that the robed figure stepped closer, and he could feel, radiating from that still form, a patient expectation of pain. He thought of his mother's face, which was already becoming indistinct in the way of childhood memories, not lost, but softening, watercoloring. He thought of Tatooine, of the sun on his skin, of the sound of Watto's voice, even because at least it was familiar. He thought of the ship that had carried him here, of the woman who had held him without comfort. And he said very quietly, "I want to leave." The figure nodded, and there was something like satisfaction in that gesture, and Anakin understood in a way that made his stomach turn that he had answered correctly, which meant his answer had damned him. That night, in the darkness of his chamber, he began to understand the particular cruelty of the Sith. It was not that they wanted him to stop wanting to leave, but that they wanted to transform that want into something else entirely. They would teach him that the desire for freedom was shameful, that it was weakness, that the only strength that mattered was the strength to want power instead. Each day brought new exercises, carefully calibrated to his small body and smaller understanding. He was made to stand in the training chamber for hours, barefoot on stone, while a trainer walked circles around him, speaking not to him but about him, in a language of criticism so constant and so precise that it began to sound like truth. You are soft, your breathing is undisciplined, you carry sentiment like a weight. You are afraid, and fear is the only honest thing you possess, so at least you have that. He was given forms to memorize, a physical alphabet of violence, not lightsaber forms. He was not yet trusted with a blade, but the movements of submission and dominance, the geometry of pain applied and pain endured. He was made to meditate in chambers where the force itself seemed to pulse like something wounded and furious, and he was told that what he was feeling was not meditation, but the beginning of his awakening. When he wept, which he did at first, they left him weeping and did not comfort him and did not punish him, which was somehow worse than either, because it meant his suffering was too small to merit attention. The other children were not his friends and were not his enemies. They were simply there, moving through the same grey hallways, bearing the same hollow look, and there was an implicit understanding that kindness between them was impossible and would be punished if attempted. By the time winter came to Korriban, Anakin was 5 years old, though he would not have recognized the word anniversary, would not have understood that a year had passed since his mother's hand released his own. The boy who stood in the training chamber was still small, still young, but something in his eyes had changed, not hardened, but rather become distant, as though the part of him that could feel joy was slowly being taught to hide deeper and deeper inside where no trainer could reach it. He had learned that the Academy would never release him. He had learned that Tatooine was a lie, that love was something they had invented to weaken him, that strength meant wanting nothing except the strength to take what you wanted from others. He had learned these things not through words, but through the patient, relentless architecture of the Sith's design. Each day another stone, placed in a wall that separated him from the light he had known. And on the deepest level, in the place where children keep their truest selves, he had learned something far more dangerous. He was beginning to believe them. In the quarters of the senior trainers, reports were filed, observations logged, progress assessed in the careful language of those who are cultivating a weapon rather than teaching a child. Aspirant 7 shows adequate physical development. Emotional attachments have been successfully disrupted. He demonstrates particular sensitivity to suggestion when anger is invoked. Recommend continued isolation and incremental introduction to more advanced techniques. The raw potential remains exceptional. With proper cultivation, he may exceed projections. By the time Anakin was 4 years old, he had begun to understand that the people around him spoke a language he could learn, but one he would never truly belong to. The Academy did not use kindness as currency, and he had stopped waiting for it. What it used instead was what the Sith Masters called truth, a steady drip of small, observable facts about the world, arranged to point always in the same direction. You were weak on Tatooine, they told him. You were powerless. Your mother could not protect you. She could not even protect herself. That is not love. That is dependency. The boy in him, the part that still remembered the sound of her voice, and the way her hands smelled of machine oil and sweat, wanted to argue. But arguing required a voice, and voices were not encouraged in the Academy. Instead, there was labor. Physical work designed not merely to tire him, but to teach him that his body could be made to obey, that pain was a thing to survive rather than flee from. Meditation chambers, where the weight of the dark side pressed down like a living thing, and the Sith trainers taught him to breathe into that pressure rather than resist it. By age 5, Anakin could sit in those chambers for hours while images, real or conjured, he was no longer certain, flooded the darkness. The spaceport on Mos Espa, the sand, the endless work that had no end, the transactions that had no mercy. The trainers would prompt him gently, in voices without inflection. And what did you feel, Aspirant 7, when your labors profited others? Frustration, he learned to say. Injustice, the need to be more than what they made me. Good, they would reply, name it more fully. What lives beneath that? What hunger? And slowly, like water finding its way down a crack, Anakin began to understand that the anger had always been there, not placed in him by the Academy, but drawn out of him, refined, given shape and direction like ore through a forge. The Sith called this cultivation. It felt, from the inside, like remembering something he had always known. At 6 years old, he was introduced to combat training against constructed practice drones, machines that moved and struck and could inflict real pain without mercy. The first time a drone caught him across the face, the trainers did not intervene. Instead, they waited, watching the moment he made a choice, to submit to the blow or to find in himself something that would never accept another blow. He found it, and it was rage. Pure, clean, and immediate. A kind of anger that felt exactly like strength flowing through his limbs, that turned his exhaustion into fire, that made him faster and more precise. When the drone fell, disabled, something in the Academy's rigid air seemed to ease. This is the way of the dark side, his trainer said, a Zabrak with dark tattoos and predator's eyes. Not submission, not denial, not the pathetic balance of the Jedi. This is the truth of power. Anakin had no framework for knowing what the Jedi were, but he understood, in the way children understand the things adults want them to believe, that there was an enemy somewhere called by that name, and that his anger was the tool they feared most. In the meditation chambers, they taught him to reach for specific memories and weaponize them. They showed him how to feel the absence of his mother's voice and transform that hollow ache into something volatile, something he could detonate inside himself when he needed fuel. They taught him that weakness was not the state of powerlessness. It was the mistake of caring about the people who had left him powerless. And in the small, sealed rooms of the Academy, isolated from anything that might contradict this, the boy who had once believed that his mother was right, that his capacity for love was a strength, began to accept that she had lied, or worse, that she had simply been weak herself and passed that weakness to him like a disease. By age 6, Anakin could summon killing intent without trembling, without hesitation, without the backward glance of mercy that the trainers taught him was the ghost of his slavery on Tatooine. They began to tell him, in the careful way of men who knew the power of narrative, about the people beyond the Academy walls. The junk dealer who had owned his mother and him, the merchants and traders who profited from the suffering of the powerless. The entire structure of the Outer Rim, they explained, was built on the backs of the enslaved, sustained by creatures who called themselves civilized while they treated beings as cargo. And then they would ask him, if you were free, truly free, with the power to reshape the world that broke you, what would you do to those who remained complicit in slavery? Anakin, at 6 years old, did not yet have words for his answer, but his body knew, the rage knew. It moved through him like a second nervous system, electric and certain. There was something the trainers were doing with these lessons that I find myself thinking about now, listening to this story from a distance. They were not lying to him about Tatooine. The slavery was real. His mother's powerlessness was real. The brutality of the system was real. But they were doing something more insidious than simple indoctrination. They were taking observations about the world that were fundamentally true and making them the whole of the truth, cutting away everything else. S.H. Mai's kindness, her choice to teach him that compassion was strength, the ways she had shielded him from the worst of the cruelty, the nights she told him stories about creatures with big hearts, and replacing it with a single narrative in which anger was the only appropriate response to injustice. The tragedy of it is that they were not wrong about the injustice. They were only wrong about what it should lead to. By the end of Anakin's 6th year in the Academy, nearly a year of his life consumed in this place, something fundamental had shifted in him. He no longer lay awake, missing the sound of his mother's voice. He had trained himself to feel, when he accessed that memory, not longing but a hot, bright resentment that she had been weak, that she had not fought harder, that she had let him be taken. The trainers called this progress. The boy, on some level he did not yet have language for, understood that it was survival. In order to live in the academy, he had to become someone the academy would want to keep. And so he did. And the child who had left Tatooine as a prisoner became, slowly and then all at once, something very close to what his captors wanted him to be. A weapon shaped by his own suffering, fueled by the conversion of love into rage, capable of extraordinary destruction, and no longer reaching out in his heart toward anything that could be taken from him again. At 6 years old, Anakin Skywalker no longer existed. In his place was something the Academy called Aspirant 7, a body that housed a will not yet entirely his own. The trials that would define the next 2 years of his life did not announce themselves as trials. They came disguised as routine, as discipline, as the ordinary structure of a day in the Academy. Each morning before dawn, he was woken by pain, a shock collar around his neck, administered by the trainers without warning or explanation, teaching him that consciousness itself was unsafe. The message was simple and unspoken. The world will hurt you without mercy, and mercy is a fiction told by the weak. In the meditation chambers deep within Korriban's stone, Anakin was placed before mirrors of polished obsidian and made to sit for hours while the trainers whispered to him in the dark. They spoke of his mother's weakness, how she had held him back, how her love was a chain that had kept him enslaved to sentiment and fear. They spoke of Tatooine as a tomb, a place where weaklings died in the sand, and only strength mattered. And slowly, terribly, the boy began to understand that everything he had loved about her gentleness, her stories, her belief that he was good, was precisely what had made them both vulnerable. There were other children in the Academy, though the trainers discouraged anything resembling friendship or kinship. The strongest were occasionally brought together in small groups, set tasks that required them to compete rather than cooperate, to prove themselves superior to one another through acts of increasing cruelty. I think about what those moments must have been like. A 6-year-old boy, torn from everything he knew, surrounded by other young people who had learned that affection was a weapon someone could use against you. There was no safety in connection, no refuge in another person's humanity. There was only the hierarchy of strength and the endless pressure to climb it. The trials of suffering took many forms, and I suspect the trainers rotated them deliberately to prevent him from ever growing accustomed to any single kind of pain. Sometimes it was physical, combat training against older apprentices, matches designed to be unwinnable, where the lesson was not victory, but the capacity to absorb punishment and continue. Sometimes it was psychological. He was given tasks he could not possibly complete, and then punished for his failure, until he internalized a twisted logic in which defeat came from insufficient rage rather than insufficient skill. Sometimes it was perceptual. He was placed in chambers where the dark side of the Force was so thick, so actively present, that it felt like drowning in a substance that was not quite air. The Force on Korriban is old, you understand. It carries the weight of thousands of years of Sith death and suffering, and a child immersed in it has no choice but to allow it to reshape him. What strikes me, looking back at this period from the outside, is how precisely calculated each element was. The trainers were not sadists acting on impulse. They were executing a curriculum. Each trial was designed to break a specific aspect of his will and rebuild it in a Sith image. His compassion, the thing his mother had instilled in him, the belief that he should be soft where the world was hard, that had to be shattered first, because it was the strongest defense against the dark side. How do you break a 6-year-old's compassion? You show him that it leads to suffering, that it makes him weak, that it cannot save him or anyone else. You make him choose between his own pain and the pain of another, and you punish him for whatever choice he makes, until he stops believing that either choice matters. His sense of identity, his name, his origin, his sense of being a distinct person with a history, that two had to be dissolved. Aspirant 7 was not a name. It was a number, a designation, a reminder that he was interchangeable, replaceable, nothing. The trainers did not call him by his birth name, not since the moment he arrived, and gradually, the sound of that name faded from his own inner voice. My son became someone else, or no one. His hope, the most dangerous thing a captive can possess, that had to be methodically extinguished. He was not told that he might someday be freed, or that the suffering would end, or that anyone was coming for him. He was simply left to understand, slowly, that this was forever, that there was no exit, that the only way forward was downward, into deeper allegiance with the force that tormented him. And yet, and this is something I find myself thinking about again and again, some part of him survived these trials intact. It is hidden, buried beneath years of conditioning, but it is there. The capacity for love does not disappear simply because it is weaponized, and the boy's essential nature was too fundamental to be entirely erased, even by the Academy's systematic brutality. By age 8, when the trials reached their crescendo, Anakin had been transformed into something the Sith trainers wanted. A young warrior moved primarily by rage, hungry for power, willing to destroy without hesitation, believing that only strength mattered and that attachment was death. He could meditate in the dark. He could draw the Force through his anger. He could wield a training lightsaber with unusual grace and deadly intent. He was, by the Academy's measure, a success. But somewhere underneath, in a place even he could not consciously access, the child who had loved his mother and believed he was the son dragon still existed, still alive, still waiting. And I think there is something profoundly important in that. The human capacity to survive even the most deliberate, most systematic effort to destroy what makes us human. He did not emerge from those trials intact. No one could have. But he also did not fully disappear, and that small, stubborn fact would matter more than anyone could possibly know. By the time he turned 8, the work was largely complete, and what Plagueis and the Academy had created was a weapon, a young man whose power was immense and whose will had been bent toward darkness. The next chapter of his transformation would be even more dangerous, because now he would be given choices, or what appeared to be choices, and the trainers would learn whether they had succeeded in convincing him that the darkness was not something done to him, but something he had chosen for himself. In the winter of 25 BBY, on a world that most beings in the galaxy scarcely knew existed, a boy of 7 years old was learning to meditate in darkness, his mind already shaped by 3 years of Sith discipline into something the galaxy had no language for. And on Coruscant, in the High Council chamber at the apex of the Jedi Temple, Master Yoda felt something move in the Force that made him pause mid-sentence, his ears tilting slightly, his ancient eyes narrowing in that particular way they did when he sensed a disturbance. It was not a sound, not a tremor of the ground, but a kind of dimming, as though somewhere in the vast connected web of the Force that the Jedi had trusted to guide them for 1,000 years, a light had been extinguished. The other council members noticed his silence. Mace Windu, whose gift for perceiving shatterpoints in the fabric of possibility was nearly unmatched, looked up from the reports spread across the holographic display before him. "What is it, Master Yoda?" Windu asked quietly. "Disturbance, there is," Yoda said, and his voice carried the particular weight of someone who had lived 800 years and learned to trust the smallest whispers of the Force. "Something lost or hidden, cannot quite say I can." Master Ki-Adi-Mundi leaned forward, his elongated head tilted with concern, and asked if it was another separatist movement, another thread of civil unrest that needed watching, because even then, in these years before the war, the galaxy was beginning to fray at the edges. "No," Yoda said, and he was quiet for a long moment, staring at nothing any of them could see. "Something darker, perhaps, or something very young and very far away." It was the second part of that intuition, the sense of something young, that troubled him most, though he could not quite articulate why. The prophecy spoke of a chosen one who would bring balance to the Force, and that child, whenever he came, would be young. The ancient text said the Force itself would see to his conception and his coming, that no Jedi need search for him, that the will of the Force would place him where he needed to be. Could this disturbance be that child? Yoda wondered. And if so, why did it feel less like light entering the world and more like light being withdrawn? Plo Koon, a member of the council whose long life had taught him patience, suggested that perhaps the disturbance was merely the signature of a powerful darksider. A Sith, perhaps, operating somewhere in the Outer Rim where the light of the Force had always been dimmer and more difficult to read. After all, Plo said, the dark side clouds everything. It is a known weakness in our perception. Yoda nodded slowly, considering this, and there was relief in the gesture, as though he welcomed an explanation that made sense, that fit into the order of things he understood. Perhaps he conceded and let the matter settle. The council had other concerns that day, more immediate ones that demanded their attention. The Trade Federation was making aggressive moves on the borders of several core worlds. Disputes over taxation and shipping rights were tying up the Senate in endless debate, and the Supreme Chancellor's government, under Finis Valorum, was showing signs of weakness that troubled even the patient Jedi. News came daily of riots on industrial worlds, of labor disputes on planets where working people felt abandoned by the Republic's distant government, of separatist rhetoric gaining followers in the Outer Rim where the light of the central government hardly reached at all. The council was stretched thin, their attention pulled in a dozen directions, and so when the disturbance that Yoda had sensed began to fade, drawn back, hidden, buried under layers of dark side shadow, there was almost a sense of relief that it had resolved itself. One less mystery to investigate, one less unknown variable in an already complicated equation. What none of them could have known was that this very disturbance being dismissed was precisely what had been orchestrated by the one being most invested in their dismissal. Darth Plagueis, the Moon's Sith Lord who had hidden himself for decades as Magister Higo Damask, the respectable head of Damask Holdings and the interplanetary banking clan, had long ago learned that the Jedi's greatest weakness was not their compassion or their trust in the light, but their assumption that they would know where to look. The dark side, Plagueis understood in a way few in the galaxy ever could, was not merely the opposite of the light. It was a kind of blindness that could be shaped like invisibility, a shadow that could be cast so carefully that it appeared to be nothing, or merely the natural dimming of distant regions where the Force had always been weaker. For years now, Plagueis had been orchestrating a slow movement of the galaxy's attention, not through grand gestures or shocking events, but through the manipulation of the mechanisms that already existed. The Senate's bureaucracy, the Trade Federation's ambitions, the careful spread of unrest in places where the Jedi's resources were already overextended. He had ensured that each new crisis, each new disturbance in the body politic of the Republic, drew the Jedi's gaze further into the political sphere and further away from the Force itself. What was a dark side signature in the Force compared to the urgent need to mediate between the Senate and the Trade Federation, to send Jedi investigators to investigate labor riots, to spread the Order's resources thinner and thinner until they were reactive rather than proactive? It was a chess match played at a scale the Jedi did not yet understand they were losing, and the beauty of it, the mathematical elegance, was that every move Plagueis made appeared on its surface to be nothing more than the natural play of galactic politics. He was not invading worlds. He was simply ensuring that the Trade Federation's expansion looked inevitable and natural. He was not redirecting the Jedi's attention. He was simply allowing existing crises to grow until they demanded the Council's focus. And most crucially, he was not hiding Anakin Skywalker. The boy was being trained, shaped, remade into something useful. But rather, he was ensuring that the light the boy once carried was so thoroughly obscured by the dark that if any Jedi's intuition did brush against it, it would feel not like a beacon of hope, but like a dimming, a loss, something that the distant light of the Jedi could not quite resolve into meaning. By the time the Jedi sensed the truth, Plagueis calculated, the boy would be so thoroughly bound to the dark that redemption would seem impossible, and the great irony would be complete. The prophesied chosen one, the one meant to bring balance to the Force, would instead have been transformed into an instrument of the Sith's final victory. So in that winter of 25 BBY, the Council dismissed their disturbance, returned their attention to the Senate reports and the Trade Federation disputes, and the machinery of the Sith continued its patient work in the darkness. And on Korriban, in the depths of the ancient academy, the 7-year-old boy who had once believed his capacity for love was a strength continued his training, unaware that the entire might of the Jedi Order had, just for a moment, almost sensed him and had chosen not to look. There is a particular cruelty in being invisible to those who might have saved you. And in this moment, with Yoda's intuition fading back into doubt, that cruelty became crystalline and irreversible. It was at the age of 9, during a regular rotation through the Academy's training grounds, that Anakin first saw Darth Maul, and everything he understood about his place in the Sith hierarchy shifted. On a night when the city of Coruscant spread beneath the Jedi Temple like a luminous circuit board, Master Yoda sat alone in the archive chamber, his small form cross-legged on the stone floor, his ancient eyes closed. At 12 years old, in the winter of 20 BBY, Anakin Skywalker stood alone in the meditation chamber of the Sith Academy, his presence moving through the dark side like pressure through water. Around him, the echoes of ancient Sith rage seemed almost gentle now, not because the rage had lessened, but because he had learned to hear it as a language, to speak it as fluently as he breathed. His trainers had long stopped calling him Aspirant 7. That had been a name for a child, still learning the shape of his own mind. They called him only Anakin now, or sometimes, in moments of approval from the older masters, simply the Prodigy. The title had been earned through a kind of terrible excellence that even Plagueis himself had begun to notice. There was something in the boy's command of the dark side that exceeded what his years should have permitted, a resonance with the Force that felt less learned and more like a language he had spoken in another life. You understand, I think, what it means when a child begins to exceed the expectations of even those who designed him for excellence. It is one thing to shape a weapon. It is another to realize, halfway through the work, that you may have awakened something that was always meant to be a weapon, something the Force itself had made for this purpose. In the years between 8 and 12, Anakin had moved through the Academy's trials with a kind of dark luminescence that unsettled even the most hardened Sith instructors. Other apprentices had broken or been broken. Their capacity for the dark side had plateaued, or they had been judged insufficient and removed from the program entirely, sent to lesser postings in the outer territories of Plagueis' empire. But Anakin had not plateaued. His mastery of Force telekinesis had evolved into something almost artistic in its cruelty. The way he could suspend a sparring opponent in midair and hold them there, suspended, feeling the weight of his own helplessness. His capacity for dark side lightning had manifested earlier than the trainers had predicted, crackling from his fingertips at age 10 with a kind of unstable, furious beauty that suggested the power was not learned, but inherited, encoded somewhere in the cellular machinery of his being. His lightsaber technique was precise and savage in equal measure, not the careful discipline of a Jedi, but the intuitive, rage-driven efficiency of a predator. There was something in the way he moved that suggested he understood combat not as a skill to be mastered, but as a language to be spoken, and he spoke it with almost perfect fluency. I find myself thinking about what must have been happening in Darth Plagueis' mind during those years, watching the boy mature into something unprecedented. Plagueis had spent centuries searching for a vessel, a living instrument through which he might eventually transfer his own consciousness, a body capable of holding both his power and his essence, immune to the ordinary limitations of age and death that bound even the immortal Sith. He had explored countless avenues: the manipulation of midi-chlorians, the study of Sith alchemy, the cultivation of the Force through ancient rituals and dark meditations. And then, almost by accident, or perhaps not by accident at all, a child had been born with a midi-chlorian count that exceeded Yoda's, the highest the Order had ever recorded, a boy whose raw Force potential seemed to have no upper limit. From Plagueis' perspective, it must have felt like the culmination of a plan so vast and patient that it transcended ordinary causality, as though the Force itself had answered his deepest desire by creating this child. By the time Anakin turned 12, Plagueis had begun the next phase of the boy's transformation. It was no longer enough to break him, to hollow out his humanity and replace it with rage and hunger for power. Now the work became refining him, polishing the raw instrument into something precise enough to hold the weight of a Dark Lord's immortal consciousness. The trials changed in character. They became less about causing suffering and more about teaching Anakin to master suffering in others, to wield pain as precisely as a surgeon wields a blade. The trainers taught him not just to destroy, but to destroy with intention, to understand that cruelty without purpose was merely savagery, that true mastery lay in the orchestration of suffering toward a specific end. They taught him to see weakness in others, in the hesitation of a rival apprentice, in the fear that flickered across a face in the moment before a death, and to exploit it with the kind of casual precision that suggested he had been born knowing how to hurt. There were other apprentices still at the academy, of course, younger ones who looked at Anakin with a mixture of fear and hunger, knowing that proximity to his power might elevate their own standing, knowing too that the cost of that proximity might be their lives. Darth Maul came and went from those years, sometimes present for training, sometimes absent on missions for Plagueis, his presence creating an odd, tense hierarchy in which Anakin occupied a space that was not quite beneath the Zabrak assassin, but not quite equal to him either. There was a kind of cold respect between them, the respect that one predator grants to another when neither has yet proven definitively which is the larger. But by 12, Anakin had begun to move into a category by himself, a rank that didn't quite exist in the ordinary hierarchy of Plagueis' organization. He was too powerful to be treated as a mere apprentice, too unstable and unpredictable to be trusted with the kind of authority that would ordinarily come with that power. So instead, he occupied a strange liminal space. He was trained directly by Plagueis himself in certain matters, allowed access to Sith knowledge and technique that should have been forbidden to one so young, permitted to see the outlines of the Dark Lord's larger designs in a way that other apprentices never were. This was not kindness, you understand. There was nothing warm in any of this. It was rather the recognition by a master craftsman that his greatest work was nearing completion, and that the final refinements could only be undertaken by his own hand. What Plagueis saw in Anakin by that winter in 20, BBY was not a child or even a young warrior, but a vessel, a consciousness shaped through suffering and dark instruction into something that might one day be emptied entirely and filled with his own immortal essence. The boy who had been torn from his mother's arms 8 years earlier, the child who had learned to transform love into shame and longing into rage, had become something that transcended the categories of normal life. He was no longer quite human in the way the Jedi would understand it, no longer capable of the light in any meaningful way, remade so thoroughly by the darkness that it would have been nearly impossible to imagine him as anything other than he was. Yet somewhere, buried so deep that even he himself could not consciously perceive it, something persisted, a tremor in the Force, a memory of hands that had taught him to fix broken things, the echo of a mother's voice telling him he was a sun dragon with the biggest heart in the galaxy. These things had not been destroyed. They had merely been buried, pressed down under years of rage and training, waiting in the deep places of his soul where even the Sith could not fully reach. And there, in that darkness, they would wait. There is something almost achingly human about the way power operates in these stories. The way even the mightiest of architects, even those who believe they control everything, are often only half aware of what they are truly creating. Plagueis believed he was refining a vessel, but perhaps he was actually forging a blade that would eventually cut in directions he had never intended. We will come to that, though. For now, let us sit with this moment. The prodigy at the apex of his transformation, the dark side ascending in him like a tide, Plagueis watching with the patience of centuries, believing that at last, after all these long years, he had found the answer to immortality. It was a beautiful hope, terrible and dark, and like all of Plagueis' greatest designs, it was built on the terrible mistake of believing that he alone held the power to shape what came next. In the outer reaches of the Outer Rim, in a spaceport on a world called Nar Shaddaa, where the lights never quite went out, and the authorities never quite knew what was happening in the dark between them, there worked a Jedi named Kellan Vess, a tracker and shadow agent of the Order who spent most of his time exactly where a Jedi was not supposed to be. Kellan had spent the last 8 years moving through the Hutt territories and the Fringe worlds, following whispers of dark side activity, chasing rumors of Sith relics, of hidden academies, of the lingering corruption that never quite died in places where the light of the Republic didn't reach. He was good at it. He had the patience for it, the willingness to move slowly, to listen more than he spoke, to sit in cantinas and pilot lounges and pick up the small tells that something larger was moving beneath the surface. What he had learned over those years was that the Sith did not hide by being absent. They hid by being woven so carefully into the texture of ordinary crime and ordinary darkness that nobody quite thought to look for them as a separate thing. But in the middle of 20 BBY, something shifted. Kellan was on Ryloth, in a settlement where the Twi'leks were still negotiating with various criminal enterprises over mining rights and labor, when he felt it in the Force. A tremor, not quite a vision, not quite a sound, more like the feeling of standing near something immensely heavy that you could not quite see. It moved away from him almost immediately, as if someone had sensed his sensing, as if the thing creating the disturbance had noticed his attention and simply withdrawn. He sat with that feeling for a long time, nursing spotchka that tasted like rust and thinking. There had been disturbances before. The Force was deep and wild, and the dark side had a way of creating small, localized tremors that meant nothing more than old rage or old trauma soaked into stone. This was different. This was young. Kellan was almost certain of it. There was something about the shape of the disturbance that suggested not age, but beginningness, a dark side presence that had not had time yet to settle into its power. He began moving methodically across the Outer Rim worlds, visiting slave markets and smuggler terminals, listening to the particular gossip that moved through those places. There was a pattern, if you knew how to look for it. Certain shipments that moved on irregular schedules to nowhere official. Certain payments that seemed to flow from the highest levels of banking institutions into the hands of local crime lords. A particular kind of silence that fell over certain transactions. A collective agreement not to ask questions. On Tatooine, he found the junk dealer Watto, who had owned a slave boy years before. Force-sensitive, apparently, though Watto either did not know or would not say what had happened to him. The Toydarian's eyes went very still when Kellan asked about the boy, and he said only that he had sold the child years ago, to merchants he did not remember and could not identify, and that he preferred not to discuss it. There was fear in that refusal, Kellan noticed. Not the usual fear of legal consequence, but something deeper. The fear of a man who had been paid very well not to remember something and did not want to be the reason that arrangement became complicated. On Geonosis, he traced connections between the slave trade and the separatist movement and found evidence that someone had been quietly acquiring Force-sensitive children for decades. On Coruscant, in meetings with the Jedi Council that he approached very carefully, he reported the disturbance and the pattern he was seeing. Master Yoda listened. his ears folding slightly as he concentrated, and then he said something that Kellen found himself turning over in his mind for months afterward. The Master said, "The Force moves in ways we do not always understand. A disturbance in the dark, it may be, but not necessarily a threat that concerns us in the immediate. The Chosen One, still hidden, the Council believes. A manifestation of raw power, elsewhere in the galaxy, perhaps. But the time of the Chosen One's arrival draws close. Master Yoda's conviction was absolute, and it was the conviction of the oldest and wisest of the Jedi, and Kellen had no counter to offer. But as he flew back out to the outer rim, he kept thinking about the shape of that tremor, the almost childlike quality to it, and he thought, what if the dark side has already won this particular race? What if the Chosen One had already been claimed by the darkness, and we did not notice because we were looking in the wrong direction? He did not report that thought back to Coruscant. He did not want to be the voice that suggested the Council's deepest fear, that somewhere in the vast dark of the galaxy, a child of unprecedented Force potential had been taken and turned before the Jedi Order even knew to look for him. Instead, Kellen Vess continued his work in the shadows, following threads that led nowhere and everywhere, watching the outer rim for signs of a dark side presence that was growing stronger, and he kept his uncertainty to himself. In the Sith Academy on Korriban, in a training chamber deep in stone that had been laid down when the world was young, a boy of 12 stood in the dark and learned to channel lightning through his fingertips. And if he sometimes thought of his mother's voice, if he sometimes heard it faintly beneath the weight of conditioning, he had long since learned not to name that as weakness, and the machinery of the Sith continued its work. The two threads moved through the galaxy, never quite meeting. Kellen's searching, Anakin transforming, and the distance between them measured not in parsecs, but in the absolute certainty that one did not know the other existed. There is a moment that comes in the life of every long watch, when the watcher finally sees what has been moving in the dark all along. In the spring of 19 BBY, that moment came to the Jedi High Council of Coruscant, and it came not as revelation, but as something closer to horror. The slow, terrible recognition of a catastrophe that had already happened, already finished its work, already written itself into the foundational structure of the galaxy. For a decade, there had been warnings, small ones easy to dismiss. A disturbance here, a clouding there, nothing that rose above the constant noise of the dark side's ambient interference, that perpetual static that had haunted Force perception since the rule of two had been established in secret more than 1,000 years before. But in the spring of 19 BBY, something changed. Master Yoda, sitting in meditation in the great chamber of the temple on Coruscant, felt it first. Not a whisper now, but a presence so vast and dark and asterisk young that for a moment his ancient mind could not find the boundaries of it. It was like discovering that a shadow you had dismissed as a small thing cast by a nearby stone had actually been the shadow of a mountain. And in the moment of recognition came the terrible mathematics of it. How long would a presence that vast take to grow, and where had it been growing, and how many years had the darkness been working while the light was elsewhere, distracted, looking for threats in the wrong directions? The council was called, and Yoda, for all his centuries of wisdom, had to speak a thing he had hoped never to speak. The possibility that the chosen one of the ancient prophecy, the boy who was meant to bring balance to the Force by destroying the Sith, had not been born into the light at all, but had been claimed by darkness before the Jedi Order even knew he existed. Master Mace Windu, who stood beside Yoda as they looked out across Coruscant's vast cityscape, could feel the weight of what that meant. If it was true, if the child had been in darkness for a decade, possibly longer, then whatever the Jedi found when they finally located him would not be a child to be saved, but a weapon that had already been forged. The Council's first and most painful task was reconstruction, going backward through the years of reports and sensations and half-noticed disturbances, trying to assemble a timeline of what had been missed. There had been a disturbance in 25 BBY, now plainly the signature of a young Force user, one whose presence had been dismissed as interference. There had been another in 20 BBY, stronger, which the Council had attributed to a concentration of dark side echoes from the Sith world of Korriban, so far away that the signal had seemed degraded and distant. There was the partial corroboration from Kellan Vess, the shadow agent who had been tracing patterns in the slave trade, who had pieced together a thread of Force-sensitive children moving through networks that should not have been connected, from Tatooine, where a Toydarian junk dealer named Watto had sold a boy child years ago, to Geonosis, to Mustafar, and beyond. The Jedi had not believed him. They had been looking for the Chosen One in the uncorrupted children of the Temple, or in the younglings born to Jedi families, or in the distant and still hidden corners of the galaxy, where a light-touched child might have been waiting to be found. The possibility that he had been taken, that he had been remade in darkness, that he was already a threat rather than a hope, this had not fit the shape of the prophecy as they understood it, and so they had not seen it. There is something almost unbearable in that realization, and I think about it often. How the very thing you are looking for can remain invisible because you cannot imagine it in the form it has actually taken. The Jedi had been watching for a child of light being born, a boy untouched by darkness, destined to rise and destroy the Sith. What they had failed to imagine was that the Sith themselves might have moved first. That they might have been patient enough, organized enough, and ruthless enough to claim the child before the light ever had a chance to know he existed. The dark side presence that Yoda felt in that moment of meditation was not a phantom, it was real, and it was close, and it had been growing for 13 years on a hidden world, fed by discipline and rage, and the kind of systematic power cultivation that only the Sith understood. The boy would be approximately 13 years old now, if the earliest reports were accurate. He would have no memory of the light, no anchor to any life before the darkness, no reason to believe that the Jedi Order existed except as an obstacle to be overcome or a lie to be unlearned. He would have been trained not to hope, not to love, not to hold on to any part of himself that might resist the will of his masters. The Jedi had, in their blindness and their trust in the prophecy and their certainty about how the future was supposed to unfold, allowed the galaxy's greatest threat to be quietly remade into an instrument of the Sith's will. The Phantom Menace, that ancient phrase for the hidden threat that works in the shadows, had always referred to the Sith as a hidden force, a presence so obscured that the Jedi could not see them even when they were near. But in this case, the Phantom Menace had a face and a name, and he was 13 years old, and he had been in the dark so long that the light would seem foreign to him and possibly hostile. The question that settled over the council chamber in that moment, the question that would shape everything that followed, was not whether they could find him, but whether, if they did find him, there would be anything left of the boy to save, or whether the Sith's work had been so complete that they would be forced to face not a corrupted child, but something far more terrible. A young warrior whose power exceeded even their collective understanding, trained specifically to destroy them. The Phantom Menace had been real all along. The Jedi had simply been looking in the wrong direction, waiting for the wrong thing, unable to imagine that the prophecy they had cherished might be answered not in salvation, but in catastrophe. And now, in the spring of 19 BBY, they had no choice but to move, and to move without any certainty at all about what they would find in the darkness. The moment comes quietly, on Coruscant, in a chamber lit only by starlight filtering through the high windows of the Jedi Temple. Master Yoda sits in meditation, his gnarled fingers folded before him, when the ripple finds him, not a sudden shock, but a slow unwinding of something that should have been hidden for another decade, perhaps longer. What he senses is old pain, a child's despair, compressed and buried beneath layers of dark side conditioning, like a scream muffled under stone. And beneath that, older still, the echo of a mother's love, so thoroughly buried that only someone with 9 centuries of meditation behind them might recognize it. Around the council table, the senior Jedi have begun to understand what Yoda already knows. The Phantom Menace was not coming toward them from the future. It had already arrived more than 13 years ago, while they were distracted by trade disputes and Senate gridlock. Master Mace Windu, sitting across from Yoda with his violet lightsaber across his lap, says quietly, "The boy. It was always the boy." The words do not need to be expanded upon. They all feel in their bones what this means. Yoda's eyes open, and they are very old and very sad, and he speaks in that measured way he has when the weight of an error has finally settled into its true proportions. 13 years, we have watched the wrong horizon. The architects of this are patient, he continues, his voice barely above a whisper. Patient as only Sith can be. They turned the boy to darkness while the council looked at politics, while I looked at distant disturbances and called them mere shadow. There is no self-pity in this. Yoda long ago learned to distinguish between regret and its wasteful cousin, blame. But there is clarity and a resolve that settles the air in the chamber like frost. Over the following hours, as spring rain begins to fall on Coruscant's upper levels, the Jedi begin to move in secret. They cannot broadcast their intent across the temple's normal channels. If the Sith have a boy this deeply embedded in their order, they almost certainly have eyes and ears scattered across the galaxy, waiting to hear what the Jedi know. And so Mace Windu, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Plo Koon, and Kit Fisto are quietly summoned to a private chamber, along with the intelligence operative Arilla Secura, who has spent years operating in the Outer Rim where the Jedi's presence is thinnest. The briefing is brief and grim. There is a child, now 13 years old, who was taken from Tatooine more than a decade ago and has been systematically remade as a Sith weapon. His midi-chlorian count is unprecedented, higher even than Yoda's, which Obi-Wan absorbs in silence, understanding immediately what that means for the scale of power they are preparing to confront. Yoda speaks to them of the Chosen One prophecy and of the terrible possibility that they have misread it entirely. Perhaps balance was never meant to be brought by a boy raised in light, but by one who carries within him the weight of both dark and light, separated, irreconcilable. "Rescue him, we must attempt," Yoda says, and the phrasing itself, "must attempt, not will succeed," acknowledges what none of them speak aloud. This boy may no longer want to be rescued. He may have been remade too thoroughly. The strike team will be small, larger forces will be detected too easily, and the Sith's shroud of the dark side makes precise triangulation nearly impossible. What they do of our fragments. Kellan Vess's earlier reports of Force-sensitive children moving through slave networks, the connection to Watto on Tatooine, traces of dark side activity that seem to concentrate on Korriban, the ancient Sith world, buried in the unknown regions where few dare to travel. Yoda will lead the mission himself, a choice that raises quiet concern among the Council. The Grand Master cannot simply disappear into the Outer Rim, not while the Clone Wars still rage, and the Republic depends on the Jedi's presence. But Yoda's answer is simple. If this boy remains lost, balance is lost. And if Sith patience this long has been, then patience our own now must be the greater. Over 3 weeks, the strike team prepares in secret. New starfighters brought to hangars that no one asks about, supplies and weapons gathered quietly, routes through hyperspace calculated to avoid detection. Mace Windu, who has spent his entire life studying the Sith and their ways, reviews what little the Order knows about Korriban, a world that radiates dark side corruption so thick that even Jedi meditation becomes difficult, where the ancient tombs of dead Sith Lords seem to whisper from the stone itself, where a young Force user raised in such an environment may have been shaped in ways the Jedi cannot fully comprehend. There is a kind of terrible clarity in these preparations, a recognition that they are not mounting a rescue, but rather a confrontation, and that the boy they are setting out to find may be less a person than an instrument that has learned to call itself a person. Obi-Wan, who was nearly the master to Anakin Skywalker in the canon that never came to pass, feels this weight more acutely than the others, though he does not speak of it. He has spent his career in service to the belief that the Jedi can change lives, can reach people even when darkness seems to have claimed them entirely. Now he is preparing to walk into a Sith stronghold to find a boy who may have been beyond reach for so long that the very concept of salvation becomes meaningless. The night before they depart, Yoda stands alone on a balcony overlooking Coruscant's lower levels, where rain has begun to fall in earnest, and the neon lights of the city blur into watercolor across the darkness. He thinks of the whispers he dismissed as residual interference, the disturbances he attributed to distant dark side corruption, the warnings from agents in the field that he interpreted through the lens of what the Order wanted to believe. He thinks of a mother on Tatooine, holding a boy for the first time, not knowing that the Sith were already turning their mechanisms toward taking him away. And he thinks of the prophecy, which has been his guiding light for so long, and wonders if perhaps the darkness was always part of the plan, not as corruption of the Chosen One, but as something that had to be understood, integrated, survived. Tomorrow, they fly toward Korriban. Tonight, the rain falls on Coruscant, and in the Jedi Temple, a very old master contemplates the price of missed chances and the fragile possibility that something might still be saved. They came in the deep of the summer, when Korriban's rust-red sky held the heat of the day, even as the sun fell behind the jagged peaks of the Sith tombs. Master Yoda did not lead them with the urgency you might expect of a rescue. He came with the patience of someone who had spent months calculating the cost of every moment, the weight of every choice made. 17 Jedi, not the entire Order, but the finest of them, descended on the hidden Sith Academy in coordinated strikes, cutting through the outer defenses with lightsabers and Force mastery honed across decades. Mace Windu, his purple blade singing in the hot air, moved through the Academy's main entrance with Kit Fisto at his side, their movements synchronized in the way that comes only from years of trust. Obi-Wan Kenobi led another team deeper into the labyrinth of training chambers, his blue lightsaber steady as it ever was. Though his mind was full of the child he was being sent to retrieve, a child he had never met, who had been stolen from the light before Obi-Wan himself was old enough to stand watch. Plo Koon and Arla Secura moved through the Academy's lower levels, where dark side meditation chambers hummed with centuries of accumulated rage and suffering, and the very air seemed to resist the light they carried. And they found what they were searching for. Not a collection of Sith Lords as ancient Sith doctrine would have demanded, but dozens upon dozens of dark side adepts, apprentices, and acolytes, an entire hidden order that violated everything the rule of two held sacred. Somewhere in that warren of stone and shadow, the Sith were maintaining a shadow Jedi order of their own, breeding dark side warriors as though the ancient law had never been written. The first resistance came quickly. Dark side users emerged from meditation chambers, their forms already half-transformed by years of hatred and dark side immersion, their lightsabers red and hungry. What happened next was as much slaughter as battle, and I think it is important to sit with that truth, rather than dress it as triumph. The Jedi were outnumbered, but they were not overwhelmed. The Sith had numbers, but lacked the discipline and unified command structure that comes from true Sith hierarchy. Mace Windu, employing Varpad, the aggressive and controversial lightsaber form he had pioneered, turned the chaos of the battle into a mirror that reflected the dark side users' own rage back upon them, exhausting them faster than they could sustain the assault. Kit Fisto, with his natural ease in water and in the depths of corrupted Force spaces, moved through the Academy's lower flooded chambers where young adepts had been trained, and the Jedi found bodies, many of them children barely older than 10 or 12. Obi-Wan, advancing deeper, came upon training logs written in neat, efficient columns. Names, midi-chlorian counts, dark side mastery assessments, notes on pain tolerance, capacity for hatred, susceptibility to manipulation. These were not monsters created whole. These were children, stolen like Anakin had been stolen, systematized like spare parts in a junk dealer's yard. The Academy's defenders fought with genuine ferocity. They had been taught that their survival depended on their power, and power meant defeating those who threatened it. But they lacked something essential. They lacked the unified purpose that comes from faith in something larger than domination. By the time Yoda himself reached the Academy's heart, moving with a deliberation that suggested he felt every one of his 900 years, the resistance was fragmenting. Some dark side adepts, seeing the Jedi were too powerful and unified, broke for the Academy's landing platforms. Evacuation shuttles rose into Korriban's rust-colored sky, carrying Sith operatives and perhaps a dozen surviving dark side users into hyperspace, toward coordinates only Plagueis and his inner circle knew. Others fought to the last, not out of conviction, but out of the simple fact that surrender had never been presented to them as an option. In the Sith Academy, one did not yield, one was destroyed, or one destroyed. Plo Koon stood over one fallen dark side adept, a girl no more than 16, whose hate had burned so brightly, and for so long that her eyes remained open even after her body had stopped moving. And he found himself thinking of the Jedi principle that all beings held the capacity for redemption, and how little comfort that principle offered in this moment. The battle lasted perhaps 3 hours from breach to clearing, though Jedi time, the suspended quality of being immersed in the Force during combat, made it feel both longer and shorter than that. When it was over, the Jedi counted their losses. 2 dead, 4 seriously wounded, several others bearing the particular kind of injury that comes from dark side Force contact, wounds that burn not just the body but the spirit. They counted the dark side users' losses differently, with somber precision. 47 dead, 23 escaped, and in the Academy's detention and training blocks, they found records of another dozen who had been killed in the months before the raid, perhaps as sacrifices in some ritual Plagueis had conducted, perhaps simply because they had become inconvenient. But they did not find Anakin in the main Academy. They found his training chamber, a room that radiated with dark side presence so thick it was almost physical, where meditation cushions faced ancient Sith murals, and the walls bore the scorch marks of Force lightning discharges so intense they had melted the stone itself. They found his training logs, meticulous records written in Plagueis' own hand, assessments of his power, calculations of his midi-chlorian count, still immeasurably high, notes on the boy's resilience to psychological conditioning, cryptic references to the vessel and the Immortality Project. They found his lightsaber, a weapon he had been forced to construct from a kyber crystal that Plagueis had provided. A crystal bled through dark side immersion until its color had shifted to that particular burning red that marks all Sith weapons, a red that seemed to pull light into itself rather than reflect it. But the boy himself was gone. Yoda stood in that chamber, his ears folding back against his skull in a gesture of profound sorrow, and he reached into the Force, searching for the presence he had sensed across the distance, the child who should have been there. He found ripples, disturbances in the Force that moved outward like the echo of screams, but no living consciousness, no current presence. Obi-Wan came to stand beside the Grand Master, and Yoda did not speak, but his silence was sufficient. The boy they had come to save was not in the Academy, and the machinery that had begun 13 years ago on Tatooine was not finished simply because one location had fallen. Master Windu was already analyzing the escape shuttle's trajectories, the hyperdrive records, the Sith network's backup systems. Somewhere in the vast dark of Sith territory, the 13-year-old who had been called Anakin Skywalker and then Aspirant 7 was alive, was moving, and was almost certainly aware that his world had been broken and remade again. The Jedi had destroyed the Academy, but in doing so, they had only transformed the hunt into something far more complex and far more urgent. As the Jedi regrouped to plan the next phase, one of the younger Jedi Knights, perhaps it was Arla Secura, voiced something that all of them were thinking, but none had yet spoken aloud. "We came to save him, but we were also hunting him. I wonder if he even knows the difference anymore." No one answered, because there was no answer that would sit easily. The Academy had fallen, but its work had already been woven into the sinews of a boy who might no longer exist in any meaningful sense. And whether that boy could be found, could be reached, could be saved, that was a question the Force itself seemed reluctant to answer. The Jedi had expected to find him in the depths of the Academy, in some dark chamber where centuries of Sith rage had pooled like groundwater. But instead, they found him standing alone in a courtyard open to Korriban's rust-colored sky, waiting as if he had known they would come. He was 13 years old, and he looked precisely like what they had made him. A weapon in the shape of a boy, dark robes fitted to his frame, his lightsaber hanging at his side, his posture the stillness of something coiled and ready. There was no running, no hiding, no attempt at negotiation or escape, and that stillness was somehow more terrifying than any aggression would have been. Master Yoda, who had sensed the disturbance in the Force for nearly a decade and dismissed it as nothing, now stood before the very thing his doubt had allowed to grow, and I think something in that moment broke open inside him that he would carry for the rest of his life. Mace Windu's hand moved toward his lightsaber, but Yoda raised his walking stick, a gesture barely perceptible, but enough. This boy had been 13 when the Jedi found him, which meant he had been 3 when they were distracted by trade disputes and political gridlock, 6 when they sensed him and chose to look away, 10 when they attributed the presence in the Force to something distant and unreal. 13 years old, and already a master of the dark side. Force lightning that could char stone, telekinesis that could hold 6 opponents suspended in the air. A double-bladed lightsaber he wielded with the fluidity that spoke of 10,000 hours of practice in darkness. Obi-Wan Kenobi, who had trained under Qui-Gon Jinn, the very Jedi Master who should have found this boy on Tatooine if the machinery of the universe had turned differently, stepped forward slowly, his own lightsaber still sheathed. And Anakin, because that is who he was, even if they had taught him to forget the name, looked at them with eyes that held no recognition, no memory of anything but the Academy, the darkness, the hunger for power that had been planted so deep in his being that he could no longer tell where the training ended and he began. What passed between them in that moment was not words, but presence. The weight of a decade of missed warnings, of distraction, of a prophecy that had been allowed to twist itself into a dark mirror of what it should have been. Yoda, ancient and weary, and seeing more clearly than he wished to see, offered what had to be offered, a choice. He did not use the formal language of redemption, because what he was asking was harder than that. He was asking the boy to choose against the only world he had ever known, the only teachers he had ever trusted, the only thing his hands had ever been trained to do. The Jedi Master's voice, when it came, was thin and sad and infinitely patient. "Come back to the light, young one. You may still," Yoda said, and the words hung in the rust-colored air like something impossible. For a moment, and I keep coming back to this moment because there is something true in it about the nature of choice itself, Anakin did not move. He stood in the courtyard of the Sith Academy. Surrounded by Jedi he had been conditioned to see as enemies, with the knowledge of decades of hatred and training layered through every cell of his being, and he stood absolutely still. I wonder sometimes what he felt in that silence, whether some part of him, the part that had loved his mother, the part that remembered Tatooine, the part that had been 3 years old and knew what it meant to be chosen, whether that part of him stirred at all. Whether the machinery of conditioning held perfectly or whether there was a crack, a fracture, a moment where the boy he was supposed to be and the boy he had been were both somehow present at once. What he did when he finally moved was to ignite his lightsaber, not in attack, but in a gesture of absolute refusal. The red blade bloomed in the courtyard, and with it came not words, but a voice so layered in dark side corruption that it barely sounded human. The voice of Plagueis speaking through his trainers, of Korriban itself, of a decade of systematic hatred, and the promise that power meant the freedom to destroy anything that tried to claim him. He did not speak, and that silence was more eloquent than any declaration could have been. He had chosen the darkness, not because he had been forced into it, though that had happened, but because the darkness was all he had left that felt like survival, like strength, like freedom. Mace Windu ignited his lightsaber in response, and the others followed. And what happened in the courtyard after that was brutal and swift, and exactly what the Jedi had hoped to prevent from the moment they realized what the Sith had done. A 13-year-old boy, trained since he was 4 years old, with a midi-chlorian count that had no ceiling and a hunger for power that had been cultivated like a garden, fought against the greatest warriors the Jedi Order could send against him. He nearly won, in the way that matters, not in defeating them all, but in the way he pushed them to the edge of themselves, the way he made them see that the boy they were trying to save was buried so deep that they might have to break him entirely to reach him. In the end, it was Obi-Wan's lightsaber across Anakin's left arm that decided it, and as the blade severed flesh and bone and the boy fell, there was a moment where his eyes cleared, truly cleared, and something like knowledge, something like the memory of having been chosen once by a mother who loved him, flashed across his face and was gone. When they lifted him from the courtyard, he was unconscious and bleeding and transformed again, not by the trainers of the Sith, but by the instruments of the Jedi, and they did not know, could not have known, whether what they carried back to their temple was a boy who might heal or merely a weapon temporarily disarmed. The tragedy of it sits with me still, that there was a moment when he could have chosen the light, and he did not, because the light had abandoned him first, distracted and doubting and slow, and by the time it reached for him, the darkness was all he had ever known. The choice that saves a soul in one story becomes the choice that damns it in another, and the only difference between them is the timing of mercy. Over the course of the summer of 19 BBY, as the Jedi raid on the Sith Academy reached its violent conclusion, Anakin Skywalker, 13 years old, a weapon fully formed by the darkness, made a choice that would echo through everything that followed. He was in the courtyard when they found him, surrounded by the noise and chaos of combat, and for perhaps the first time in his life, he was offered something other than pain, the possibility of redemption, of return, of being taken back into the light. Master Yoda stood before him, ancient and patient, and spoke words that Anakin had no framework to understand, that he could be saved, that the Jedi would teach him, that his life did not have to be what the Sith had made it. But in that moment, standing in the courtyard where he had trained in rage and precision for nearly a decade, something closed in the boy's chest. There is a certain point in a person's transformations, and I find myself thinking about this often, when the thing done to you becomes indistinguishable from the thing you have chosen, and at that threshold, redemption itself becomes a kind of violence. Anakin ignited his lightsaber, the blade emerging red and trembling, and refused. It was not defiance born of loyalty to the Sith, though the Sith had worked tirelessly to cultivate that, nor was it simple acceptance of what he had been made to become. It was something far more complicated and far more tragic. It was the choice of a boy who no longer possessed the architecture to understand himself as anything other than what darkness had built. Mace Windu, the master of the Varpad form, moved toward him first, his purple blade a blur of controlled aggression, and Anakin met him with the fury of 13 years' accumulated rage. The boy's lightsaber work was extraordinary, impossibly precise, fueled by the dark side enhancement that made his movements faster than a child's body should have allowed, and there was no hesitation in him, no divided heart asking whether this was right. Obi-Wan Kenobi pressed from the other side, and in that moment, I think Obi-Wan may have glimpsed something of what the boy might have been, what the Order might have cultivated in him had he arrived at the temple as a child, instead of as a weapon already half-formed. But there was no time for that recognition to translate into mercy. The duel had its own momentum, and Anakin was fighting not just for his life, but against the very idea that his life could be anything other than this. The Force gathered around him as he fought, telekinesis pulling at his enemy's feet, dark side energy crackling through his body, pushing outward in waves designed to break bone and will simultaneously. Kit Fisto moved to support Windu, and then Arla Secura, and Anakin was surrounded by Jedi Masters, each of them trying to subdue rather than kill a 13-year-old boy, and that constraint became its own kind of tragedy. Because the boy gave them no quarter, because he had been taught that mercy was a lie and that the only truth was power, and the willingness to use it absolutely. The duel lasted perhaps 5 minutes, though I imagine it felt far longer to everyone involved, and in the final seconds, as Anakin pressed forward in a desperate, brilliant assault, Obi-Wan made the decision that would define everything afterward. He cut with precision and without mercy, and Anakin's left arm fell away, severed at the shoulder, and the boy dropped to his knees. For a moment there was silence in the courtyard, broken only by the sound of other battles distant in the academy, and Anakin knelt bleeding and armless before the people who had come to save him, and he did not ask for mercy. The unconsciousness that took him was a mercy of a different kind, the body's mercy, the small grace of surrender to shock and blood loss. And when he woke, days later in a Jedi detention facility on Coruscant, everything had changed and nothing had changed at all. The scars that would mark him were not only the missing arm and the cauterized wound where it had been, but something deeper, the knowledge that he had chosen the darkness, or believed he had, which may be the same thing. I think about what happens in that space between captivity and transformation, about how a person remakes themselves in the image of their chains, and I wonder whether the boy who woke in that detention cell was still salvageable, or whether, in choosing to fight rather than to accept redemption, he had carved out a path that could never quite be walked back from. What I know is this: the Jedi had finally found the Chosen One, but they had found him broken and unreachable, turned into an instrument so perfectly forged that even the people who had learned to love him would struggle to believe that any part of him remained worth saving. And in that courtyard, with the boy's blood on the stones and his arm severed, and the terrible victory achieved at such cost, the Jedi Order faced the full weight of what it meant to have waited too long. The prophecy that the Chosen One would bring balance to the Force had been twisted into something unrecognizable, and no one in that courtyard could have said whether balance was still possible or whether Anakin Skywalker was now something far stranger, a catalyst that had already begun to tear the Order itself apart, a living wound that would never close. The detention chamber beneath the Jedi Temple was not a cell in the way a prison cell is a cell. The Jedi, in their way, believed that every space could be made into a place of healing, and they had tried to make this one so. The walls were pale stone, the light gentle, and diffused through skylights that opened onto the upper gardens of Coruscant, where the sound of water moving over fountains occasionally drifted down in patterns the architects had believed would soothe the mind. There was a meditation mat, a simple sleep platform, a small table with food that came twice daily, and nothing else. No edges to strike, no chains that needed to be struck, nothing that could become a weapon in the hands of someone who had been taught from childhood that violence was thought-given form. When Anakin woke on the first morning, the absence of walls felt more imprisoning than any cell could have been. His left arm was gone below the shoulder. The stump was bound in back-to-treated synth flesh that hummed with a faint current of healing energy. And for the first time in 13 years, he felt something that was not rage or hunger, but loss. He lay on the sleep platform and did not move, because moving meant accepting that the loss was real. Master Yoda came to visit him on the third day, moving slowly through the chamber on his cane, his ears folding slightly as he regarded the boy lying motionless on the platform. "Healed your arm, I could not," Yoda said quietly, settling himself onto a stool that had been brought in for his visits. Severed too cleanly, it was, in the lightsaber's heat. Regrow itself the limb cannot, not as the flesh was, and attach it again your mind will not allow. Anakin did not respond, and Yoda sat in the silence for a long time, his ancient eyes closed as if he were meditating in the presence of the boys, suffering rather than speaking about it. "Angry you are," Yoda finally said. "Correct, that anger is not. Born of loss it is, and loss is real, and real things deserve to be felt. But use that anger to wound yourself further, you must not." "You came too late," Anakin said, and his voice was different than the voice of the boy who had fought in the academy courtyard. Flatter, more hollow, as if something had been drained out of it when his arm fell to the stone floor. "Yes," Yoda said, without any attempt at comfort or excuse. "Too late we came. That is a truth, and carry that truth I will for as long as I remain in this life. But what is true of my failure need not become true of your future." Over the weeks that followed, the work of deconditioning began in earnest, though no one called it that in Anakin's presence. The Jedi brought in a healer named Master Sith, who specialized in the aftermath of dark side training, and who understood in a way that Master Yoda could not that the boy's body and mind had been weaponized, and that healing it would require untangling the two. "The dark side is seductive," Master Sith explained to him in their first session, sitting across from him in a meditation chamber with pale walls and the sound of water somewhere beyond them. "It offers simplicity. It tells you that your anger is justified, that your hunger is natural, that the world is unjust, and therefore you are owed power. These things are partly true, which is what makes the seduction so perfect." "I don't want to hear about the dark side," Anakin said. "I want to know if I can ever use my legs the way I used to, or if that's gone too." "That," said Master Sith gently, "is exactly the kind of question that the dark side teaches you to ask. Not whether you can heal, but whether you have been permanently diminished. Not whether you can learn to live differently, but whether you are owed the life you lost. Do you see the difference?" Anakin did not answer, but he began showing up to the meditation sessions, sitting on the mat across from Master Sith, and learning to breathe in the way that Jedi were taught to breathe, not to suppress the darkness within him, but to observe it the way you might observe a storm passing over a landscape, acknowledging its presence without allowing it to drown you. The teachings of the light side, when Anakin finally began to absorb them, felt less like a philosophy and more like a language he was being asked to learn after a decade of speaking only in the vocabulary of rage and hunger and fear. "Fear leads to anger," Master Yoda told him in another visit, his ancient voice carrying the weight of centuries of teaching this single chain of reasoning. "Anger leads to hatred. Hatred leads to suffering. This you have been taught the opposite, that anger is strength, that hatred is clarity, that suffering is proof of power. But I tell you, what you feel now, the emptiness where your arm was, the confusion at the silence where rage used to live, that is suffering born of what you have been taught to believe about yourself, and it can be unmade." "Can it?" Anakin asked. "Or am I just supposed to pretend it can until I believe it?" "Neither," said Yoda. "Allow it to be true for now, you must, without belief or pretense. True belief will come, or it will not, but the work of healing does not require belief. It requires only patience and willingness to sit with what is broken and tend to it, rather than burn it to ash." Over months, Anakin began a small meditation practice, nothing elaborate, nothing that required him to abandon the part of himself that understood power and hunger and rage, but rather to sit beside those things in silence and observe them without feeding them. He was given texts to read, the Jedi Code, teachings on the nature of attachment, philosophical writings on the balance of the Force, and he read them with the same methodical precision he had once applied to mastering dark side techniques, trying to understand not whether they were true, but how they could possibly be true given everything he had been taught. It was not healing, not yet, but it was the beginning of a space in which healing might eventually happen. In his 4th month in the detention chamber, Master Sith asked him to speak about his mother, and Anakin sat for a long time before he said anything at all. "The Academy taught me that she was weak," he finally said, his voice very quiet. "That her love was the thing that enslaved me, that I was right to stop thinking about her." "And do you believe that?" Master Sayev asked. "No," Anakin said, and the single word seemed to cost him something. "But I also don't know how to remember her without it hurting. And the dark side said that hurt was weakness, and the light side is saying that hurt is what? Proof that I loved her. That doesn't make the hurt matter less." "It does not," Master Sayev agreed. "But it makes the hurt mean something different. In the dark side, hurt is proof of your weakness. In the light, hurt is proof that you are human and capable of love. Both of these things hurt, but one of them leaves room for you to become something other than an instrument of pain." He was allowed, eventually, to walk the upper corridors of the temple under supervision, and he moved through those halls like a ghost learning to inhabit his own life, his empty sleeve pinned back carefully, his eyes down. Other Jedi watched him with expressions he could not read: pity, fear, uncertainty, and he understood that he was a question the Order had not yet learned how to answer. In the silence of the temple at night, when the water fountains sang, and the lights of Coruscant spread below like a vast, indifferent darkness, Anakin would sit on the meditation mat in his chamber and try to hold in his mind the image of his mother's face, reconstructed from memory and from the years that had tried to bury it. It was a small rebellion against everything the Sith had tried to teach him, and it was not redemption, but it was something. It was the beginning of remembering that he had once been loved, and that being loved did not have to mean being weak. It was enough, for now, to continue. 1 year has passed since the raid on the Academy, and the galaxy has changed in ways that no one quite anticipated, though perhaps it should have. In the detention cells beneath the Jedi Temple, the 13-year-old Anakin sits in meditation, his left arm a phantom ache that no amount of force breathing can entirely quiet, and somewhere in the dark spaces of the Outer Rim, Darth Plagueis and those loyal to him have begun to move again. The Sith Lord survived the raid on Korriban. He always survives. That is the fundamental discipline of his existence. But the loss of the Academy, the death of so many dark side adepts, and the capture of his greatest work have crystallized something in him that runs deeper than rage. A kind of patient, terrible clarity about what must come next. You must understand that the rule of two dictates a certain loneliness. Plagueis has never had the luxury of large organizations or scattered cells, and yet even within that constraint, the dark side has always found ways to persist, to echo across the Force like ripples that refuse to settle. In the months following the Academy's fall, Plagueis reconnected with agents he had cultivated for decades: financiers, senators, military officers, beings in positions of quiet influence who had long ago sworn themselves to the Sith cause not through formal apprenticeship, but through the gravitational pull of ambition and fear. These were not Force users, for the most part. They were something more useful, people embedded in the machinery of galactic governance who understood that the Sith do not conquer from without, but erode from within. The strategy was old, refined across centuries of Banite discipline, and it had worked magnificently before, which meant it could work again. What had changed in Plagueis' calculations was the question of time. He no longer had the luxury of decades to maneuver in silence, because the Jedi now knew where to look, and they were desperate, and desperation made them unpredictable. And so the work became twofold: reclaim Anakin if possible, or turn him if capture proved impossible, while simultaneously creating enough chaos across the galaxy that the Jedi Order, already fractured by the knowledge of their own blindness, would fracture completely. On Corellia, Sith agents orchestrated labor strikes and industrial sabotage that destabilized the shipyards and put thousands out of work. The unrest was real enough, born of genuine grievance, but it was given shape and direction by those who had been patient, waiting for their moment. On Geonosis, whispers were spread through the hive minds of the factory districts about Jedi complicity in Republic exploitation. The truth was irrelevant. The point was to plant doubt, to suggest that the Order had abandoned the Outer Rim to suffering while they played politics on Coruscant. In the core worlds, Plagueis' financial agents moved money in ways that created the appearance of a republic in crisis. Inflation, currency instability, rumors of embezzlement from the treasury that were not entirely untrue, because truth is the most effective vehicle for a lie. The master of the dark side understood something that the Jedi often forgot. The galaxy does not need to be conquered by an army. It only needs to stop believing that anyone is in control of it. In the detention block of the temple, Anakin could feel all of this happening, a kind of distant tremor in the Force, not the clear voice of connection that the Jedi taught, but a shadow, a knowing without knowing how he knew. Master Yoda would come to sit with him and speak of the light, and Anakin would listen, and some part of him would reach toward that teaching the way a plant reaches toward sunlight. But another part of him, buried deeper, could feel his former masters working, moving, remembering him. There were nights when Anakin could have sworn he felt Plagueis' presence, not close but present, like a hand held just outside the walls of the temple, patient and waiting. I think about this a lot, the particular kind of isolation that comes from being pulled in two directions by forces far more powerful than yourself, when even the people trying to save you cannot quite fathom what you're being saved from. The Jedi believed they were protecting Anakin by keeping him locked away, giving him time to heal, offering him teachings of balance and compassion. And in a sense, they were right, because the alternative was to let him walk free, and he was not yet ready for freedom. But they did not fully account for the fact that a Sith-forged bond, once created, does not simply dissolve in the presence of light. It echoes, it pulls, it calls across the Force like a song you cannot stop hearing. By the middle of 18 BBY, the strikes on Corellia had begun to turn violent. Workers clashed with security forces, and in the chaos, Sith agents whispered that the Republic was no longer capable of maintaining order, that strength was the only language the galaxy understood. The Jedi, stretched thin as they prepared their response to spreading unrest, found themselves in the position of having to choose between going to the Outer Rim to prevent crisis and staying close to Anakin, ensuring that his deconditioning continued and he did not slip back into the darkness. It was a choice that Plagueis had engineered, with the precision of someone who had spent centuries learning how to move his enemies like pieces on a board. In the temple, Anakin grew stronger in body, a prosthetic arm grafted again, replaced with a better one, each modification taking him further from the boy he had been and not quite bringing him into the man he might become. The phantom pain in his severed arm never went away, and the Jedi told him that this was natural, that the Force remembered what the body had lost. But what they did not tell him, or perhaps what they could not see, was that the pain itself was becoming another kind of connection, another way that the past kept its hold on him. There is something I find myself wondering about in all of this, whether redemption, if it is truly possible at all, requires not the erasure of what you were made to do, but the conscious, daily choice to do something else instead. Whether a weapon, once forged, ever stops being a weapon, or whether it simply becomes a weapon that chooses, moment by moment, not to strike. By autumn of 18 BBY, the Jedi Order had begun to crack under the pressure, not catastrophically, but noticeably. There were whispers of inconsistency in the Council's responses, of resources being pulled thin, of senior masters arguing about whether the focus should remain on Anakin's rehabilitation or on the growing threats across the galaxy. And in the detention cells, the boy who had been taught by the Sith to hunger for power sat in meditation, and the question hung unanswered in the air between his captors and his unseen architects. Who was truly teaching him now? The dark side does not operate only through direct contact. It operates through the very fact of distance itself, through the knowledge that you are not abandoned, that someone in the darkness is still thinking about you, still has plans that include your name. In the detention chamber beneath the Jedi Temple, where the afternoon light filters through high windows and falls across the floor in rectangles of gold, A young man sits alone with his thoughts and the absence of his left arm. He is 16 years old, though his eyes hold something older, not wisdom, but the weight of things too heavy for youth to bear. His name is Anakin Skywalker, though he spent 13 years answering to Aspirant 7. And the man he was under that name is not entirely gone, no matter what the Jedi would like to believe about redemption and the light. 3 years have passed since the raid on Korriban, since the morning he woke in this chamber and understood that the Sith had not come to reclaim him, that the machinery of rescue had finally, impossibly, turned in his favor. But rescue and transformation are not the same thing, and the Jedi learned this slowly, the way one learns truths that ache to accommodate. In the beginning, they tried the direct approach. Master Yoda himself would sit with Anakin for hours, speaking of the Force, of balance, of the light side's teachings, as if understanding could unbuild what understanding had constructed. But Anakin's conditioning was not something to be unlearned like a language or a set of combat movements. It was woven into the substrate of how he understood himself and the universe. The rage that had been cultivated in him, that careful, systematic cultivation that began when he was 4 years old, did not simply evaporate when he was told it was anger, and anger was not strength. Instead, it calcified, becoming something almost geological, a part of him that he could acknowledge but not remove. I think Master Yoda began to understand, around the end of that first year, that they were not so much healing a wound as learning to live alongside a wound that would never fully close. Meditation became the primary tool, because meditation did not ask him to abandon his nature, but to observe it, to sit quietly with the rage and the hunger for power and the ghost memory of his mother's voice, which by then had returned to him with an intensity that bordered on unbearable. That voice, the words about the sun dragon, about the strength of a soft heart, was locked inside him like a prisoner, and the prisoner had been growing louder as the years passed. When he first remembered her clearly, in the meditation chamber on a still afternoon in 18 BBY, Anakin wept in a way that the Sith trainers would have called weakness, and the Jedi called part of his healing. He could not, at that moment, see how the two might be reconciled. There were necessarily dark days. Days when the phantom sensation of his missing arm would compound with the phantom voice of Darth Plagueis echoing through the Force, a presence that did not disappear entirely even after the Master's physical form was destroyed, but lingered like a hand that refused to let go. On those days, Anakin would feel the pull toward the darkness as clearly and urgently as hunger, as if the Force itself were calling him back to what he had been made to be. He had been constructed for that darkness so meticulously, so thoroughly, that the alternative, the light, the Jedi path, sometimes felt like asking him to reject his own skeleton. The Jedi never said this aloud in his presence, but he could feel it in their careful monitoring, their unease. The question of whether anything worth saving remained in the boy they had rescued. What they did not fully understand, I think, was that this question mattered less than they believed. Redemption is not a return to innocence, because innocence, once taken, cannot be recovered. Anakin would never be the child his mother held on Tatooine, the boy who believed his capacity for love was a strength in any straightforward sense. He had learned too thoroughly that love could be taken, that attachment was leverage, that the people you cherished could be used as instruments against you. What was being slowly, painfully reconstructed was not innocence, but something harder to name. The choice to acknowledge his darkness without being consumed by it, to recognize his rage without allowing it to shape every decision, to carry the memory of what he had been made to do without permitting it to define what he could become. By 16 BBY, when he was 16, Anakin had begun to occupy a strange middle space, neither fully Sith nor fully Jedi, and the Jedi were learning, with obvious discomfort, to let him exist there. He wore their robes, though they hung strangely on him, as if tailored for a different person. He participated in meditation circles, where his presence sometimes created a visible tension, not hostility, but the recognition that in his mind lived wars that were not yet concluded. Other younglings were sometimes cautious around him, and their caution was not entirely wrong. The predatory instincts that the Sith had cultivated in him did not disappear because he had chosen the light. They simply became something he had to choose, consciously, not to act upon. This was exhausting in a way that the Jedi, who had never been forged in darkness, could not entirely comprehend. Yet something else emerged alongside the exhaustion, a kind of clarity that came from having stood in both worlds. Anakin began to understand the Sith teachings not as absolute truth, but as a particular philosophy born from particular circumstances. Hunger for power, fear of death, the belief that the universe belonged to the strong and the weak deserved what they received. He understood how seductive it was, especially to a child who had been powerless, to be told that anger was the answer and strength the only virtue that mattered. And he began, slowly, to understand something that neither the Sith nor the Jedi fully grasped, that both sides were incomplete. The Sith were right that the Jedi teachings sometimes denied reality. That loss was inevitable, that fear was natural, that the desire to protect those you loved was not weakness. But the Sith were wrong, that the answer was to abandon attachment and embrace only power and domination. The truth, if there was one, seemed to live in the space between. To love fully while accepting loss, to acknowledge your rage while choosing not to be ruled by it, to seek strength not as an escape from vulnerability, but as a container for it. By 16 BBY, he was still learning what that meant, still some mornings waking from dreams of the academy, still sometimes feeling the phantom call of the darkness he had been shaped to embody. But he was learning. And the Jedi, with cautious patience, were learning alongside him. There was no redemption arc, no moment where he felt fully healed, no return to wholeness, only this: a broken young man in a chamber full of light, carrying the weight of years he had not chosen to live, slowly discovering that it was possible to carry that weight and move forward anyway. This is what the Jedi did not anticipate when they rescued him from Korriban, that the price of saving the Chosen One would be learning to love someone forever divided, forever carrying the evidence of their failure to protect him sooner. The machinery of his suffering had been so perfectly constructed that redemption could never be a return, only a transformation, and transformation is never clean. We arrive now at a moment that was always going to come, though not in the way anyone expected. A test so profound that it would decide, once and for all, what Anakin Skywalker truly was. A decade and a half has now passed since that summer when the Jedi raid brought the fortress down, and we find ourselves in a new era, not one reborn, but one grimly persisting in a shape nobody quite expected. The Galactic Empire, as it calls itself, has stood for 3 years, and the Republic that preceded it is remembered now chiefly by those old enough to have served it, or scholars who study the transition with the careful neutrality of those recounting the death of something they did not themselves mourn. In the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, or what remains of it, what the Empire has been permitted to leave standing as a place of confinement rather than teaching, there is a young man now, 17 years old, who wakes each morning with the ghost of an arm he no longer possesses. His name is Anakin Skywalker, though many in the temple have stopped using it, preferring simpler designations. The prisoner, the broken prodigy, sometimes simply Anakin when they think no one is listening, and something in them still believes he might become something other than what he was forged to be. And the question that hangs over him, over the temple, over the entire Jedi Order in this diminished and persecuted era, is a question with no clean answer. Is he the chosen one, as the prophecy demanded, or has that prophecy been so thoroughly perverted and shattered that the prophecy itself has become meaningless? There is a meditation chamber beneath the temple, a small, quiet space where light enters only through a narrow slot in the eastern wall, and the Force is present but gentle, not screaming as it does in the places where so many Jedi died when the Order fell. It is here that Anakin spends his days, or the better part of them, working with what Master Yoda calls the long discipline of acceptance, a practice that asks not that he banish his rage or deny his darkness, but that he sit with it, acknowledge it, understand it as something that lives in him but does not define the totality of what he is. This took many months to teach him, because everything the Sith Academy had instilled in him, everything that kept him alive through 13 years of darkness, was built on the principle that denial of weakness was the path to strength. To sit and acknowledge rage without acting on it felt like drowning. But over time, over countless small repetitions and patient refusals to look away, something shifted in him. He began to understand that his anger was real. It was not something to overcome by pretending it did not exist, and that choosing not to be consumed by it was not weakness, but something harder, something that required more strength than anything the Sith had asked of him. I think about this often when I consider what has become of the prophecy in the years since the Academy fell. Because on the surface, the story looks like failure. The Chosen One was supposed to bring balance, and instead the Sith are gone, but only because they were destroyed by the very machinery that created Anakin, by a man named Palpatine who wore many masks and who Darth Plagueis did not foresee, who turned the apprentice duel into something that ultimately consumed the very power structure Plagueis was building. And yet, in another way, in a way that is almost too quiet to notice, unless you sit in that meditation chamber and listen to a 17-year-old boy breathe in the darkness and choose, moment by moment, to remain connected to the light, there is something that might be called fulfillment. The Jedi Order, in its diminished form, gathered a year before to discuss this exact question. The debate was painful because it was honest. Master Yoda argued that the prophecy had been fulfilled, but not in the manner anyone had anticipated. The Chosen One did bring balance, but the balance was achieved not through a triumphant victory at the height of his power, but through his shattering, his reclamation and his choice, repeated daily, in silence, to walk the more difficult path. Mace Windu, one of the few who survived the purges alongside Yoda and a handful of others, was less certain. He said that if Anakin had been claimed by darkness, if he had spent 13 formative years being remade as a Sith instrument, then perhaps the prophecy itself had been corrupted or twisted beyond recognition. Perhaps, he suggested quietly, the Chosen One was not Anakin Skywalker at all, but some other child not yet found, and the machinery that shaped Anakin had merely obscured the true fulfillment that was still to come. Obi-Wan Kenobi, present only in spirit through a holo-cording, but he is kept to exile on Tatooine, watching over the young child Luke Skywalker, Anakin's son, born in the ashes of everything Anakin became, offered a different thought. He suggested that the prophecy might be large enough to contain both truths, that Anakin was the Chosen One, and that his fulfillment of that role would not look like redemption, but like redemption's inverse, the slow, patient work of learning to carry darkness without being defined by it, of being broken and refusing to stay broken. The conversation never reached a conclusion, because there is no conclusion to reach. The prophecy speaks of balance, and balance has been achieved, but the man who achieved it is neither wholly light nor wholly dark, and he moves through the world not as a savior returned, but as a living question mark, a wound that is slowly, imperfectly healing. Out in the wider galaxy, the debate continues in different form. The Jedi survivors and their sympathizers are accused by the Empire of harboring a dark side user, of keeping Anakin Skywalker imprisoned because he is too dangerous to release, too corrupted to trust. Some in the Outer Rim whisper that Anakin is a weapon. The Jedi are preparing for a future strike against Imperial power. Others believe he is simply a boy broken beyond repair, kept alive out of sentimentality rather than hope. But I think what is happening in that meditation chamber, what has been happening for 3 years now, is something stranger and more difficult than any of these explanations can quite capture. It is the slow, unglamorous work of a human being learning to sit with the things done to him and the things he did, learning to understand that his darkness does not disqualify him from choosing light, and learning, most of all, that the capacity to be broken and to choose healing anyway might itself be a kind of wholeness. Does this fulfill the prophecy? I do not know. The ancient words speak of one who will bring balance and destroy the Sith, and by the usual measure, the enemies defeated, the victory claimed. The prophecy has been satisfied by someone else entirely, someone who has not yet been born when Anakin was claimed by darkness. But there is another interpretation, quieter and harder to defend, which holds that the balance the prophecy spoke of was not a balance of power in the galaxy, but a balance within the Force itself. The acknowledgement that the light and the dark cannot be separated, that a being of absolute light is as impossible as a being of absolute dark, and that the truest expression of balance is not the defeat of one side, but the integration of both within a single human heart. And if that is the fulfillment, then the 17-year-old boy who wakes each morning with the phantom ache of a missing arm, who chooses light not because he has been healed, but because he understands that choosing it is itself the healing, then perhaps he is the chosen one after all. Perhaps the prophecy was never about a victorious warrior, but about a person broken and remade so many times that they learned, finally, the deepest lesson of the Force, that you do not destroy the darkness